tonight, Soul of a Citizen, Living with Conviction in a Cynical Time. My name is Sue Mays, and I'm up here because I was around 25 years ago when we started the Lou Douglas Lecture Series, and it's an honor to be back here tonight. I'd like to welcome the large crowd this evening, the friends of Lou Douglas from both the Kansas State University community and the Manhattan community, and special welcome to the students that are here from freshman seminar and from leadership studies and the public speaking and journalism classes on campus. We know there's a lot going on tonight. There's a lot of people that are conflicted about being at the debate. We want you to know that within a few feet of this room there is a debate watch party that's starting at 8 o'clock tonight in the Flint Hills room, and we're hoping to wrap it up and get you there as quick as we can. There is, though, a reception and book signing in the Union Courtyard for those of you who'd like to engage in further discussion with our author. That will be outside in the courtyard immediately following. There's a lot of related activities if you picked up a brochure when you came in the door, from being online where you can be engaged in conversations. There are seminars tomorrow. There's a book club on Saturday. So there are many opportunities to follow and continue this conversation. We anticipate the lecture will be about 45 minutes, and then we'll pause and go into questions and answers, and our speaker does want you to know that that's where he finds the engagement really very exciting. So we hope that you can stay. We also understand there will be some that will want to leave for the debate. So we will pause for a second so questions, people can come down. It is being taped, so please do come down to the microphones. I want to just give you a little snapshot of Lou Douglas, since I did have a personal experience getting to know Lou, and he would love to be here tonight to talk about conviction because he lived his life with conviction. Whether it was helping to segregate the barbershops in Aggieville, or working to organize Democrats in Kansas, or his own protest of the Vietnam War, or helping build UFM's community resource program, Lou lived a life of conviction. Lou would also like to be here right now to help debate the intensity that's going on in this 2004 presidential election. He taught the American presidency here at Kansas State, and I was his student. His door was never closed, and students frequently found their way into Lou's office to simply sort out the confusion of the time and of everyday politics. I hope each of you have found a professor on this campus that opens his or her door and takes the time to help you relate your own educational experiences. There is nothing greater than a true mentor, especially one that challenges you to take a stand and let your voice be heard. Lou Douglas was my mentor. Lou would love to also be here and help us sort out all the political ads that are going on, from the congressional candidate who's a terrorist because they supported or asked that we not go to war. Perhaps Lou would have been called a terrorist because he too protested the Vietnam War, but in those days we called it a communist. Lou would also like to be here to look at the stable growth of the community resource program, because when Lou retired, he came to me and asked what he could do of value to give back to the community. And we were trying to take the model of UFM and move it out to small communities across Kansas. And for a $1 bill, which we framed, Lou spent a year with us. And he got passed at the state legislature the Community Resource Act, which still enables UFM today to help rural communities across Kansas establish community resource programs. So that's a small snapshot of Lou Douglas. Another person with conviction is my friend Carol Gould, and Carol is going to introduce our speaker. Carol is director of the Kansas Center for Rural Initiatives, which is the campus home for the Community Service Program. And this center has provided direct service to over 1,600 students during the past year. If you're not aware of it, October 18th through 22nd is the Community Service Week, and it's a way for you to get involved and give back to the community where you're now living. Also, the Martin Luther King Day is also a day that Carol, they don't call it a day off, they call it a day on, a day for you to be here and help in the community. So I encourage all of you to be involved in this through the Community Service Program. It may be the most significant and life-enriching event of your college career. Carol?
Thank you, Sue, and good evening to all of you. I believe it is especially appropriate that we're hearing from Paul Loeb this evening. Appropriate not only because of this lecture series that Sue described so well and named after our friend Lou Douglas, who was a champion of civic engagement and civic responsibility, but also because of the season that we're in. This is a season, I believe, of contrasts. The contrasts of cynicism versus hope, of individualism versus social activism, of political disengagement versus civic responsibility among our citizens. And those contrasts are in full bloom when we're going through election in our country. It brings out our best and our worst. Unfortunately, the bloom fades quickly after the election when we all go back to our daily lives, when the media blitz dies down and our talk and attention turns to other things that are pressing in our lives, and the ranks of the cynical and the disengaged grow. We lose our interest, our attention goes away. In the community service program, we talk about being on a first-class cabin of the Titanic. And I'd ask you to think about that for just a minute. A first-class cabin with all the luxury it provides. When we ask students how they feel about their future and what they expect, we hope you feel positive, and you do. You feel positive about the lives that you're going to create and positive about your future. But when we think about the world around us and what's going on, in many cases that future is not quite so rosy. We are on a first-class cabin on the Titanic. So in that cabin, we go about living our personal lives while absolving ourselves from responsibility for the sinking ship, the critical social, economic, and environmental issues that our community and our society is facing. But it doesn't have to be that way, because we can all make choices. It can't be that way if our communities and our democracy are to succeed. We all have those choices to make about how we live our lives as citizens, and that's what Paul Loeb teaches us. Paul has spent over 30 years researching and writing about citizenship responsibility and empowerment, exploring what leads some of us to get involved in community issues while others opt out. He was born in California. He attended Stanford and the New York New School for Social Research. He was an active protester during the Vietnam War, debating those issues in a very public way. He's written 4, and now 5, widely praised books, and has lectured, well, we were just talking, he gives about 50 lectures a year around the country. But he has lectured at least at 300 colleges and universities, and always is giving conference presentations and writing articles. He is prolific in his work. Let me tell you just a little bit about his books. His first book, Nuclear Culture, explored the daily world of atomic weapons workers in Hanford, Washington, a history that you really ought to read. Hope in Hard Times examined the lives and vision of ordinary Americans involved in the grassroots peace activism. Generation at the Crossroads explores our campus lives here, the lives we all lead, and the values and choices of American college students. Soul of a Citizen, which is probably the book we all know the best, looks at what it takes to lead a life of social commitment. And the new book, The Impossible Will Take a Little While, is an anthology about political hope, containing the writings of not only Paul, but of many world leaders who've written on this subject. Paul is also an affiliate scholar at Seattle Center for Ethical Leadership, working with Bill Grace, the director there, who we had on our campus about 3 years ago. I would urge you to go to Paul's website. It is a wonderful website, contains a wealth of information, including a lot of detail about all the articles he's written and the places that he's spoken, a lot more about his writings. It contains articles. You can sign up for his email list on that website, which comes out monthly and contains articles. And we also have a sign-up list that we'd urge you to put your name on, that's out in the foyer and will be at the reception. Also contained on that website are discussion questions for faculty members who might want to use Soul of a Citizen as part of the classroom. You can get discussion questions off that website. A wonderful service learning reflection. As I was rereading Soul of a Citizen in preparation for tonight, I was reminded of the power of storytelling, because stories are a big part of that book, and stories are one of the lessons Paul teaches us in the book. And it talks about the ways in which we can touch others in a very real way through our stories and empowerment. Tonight, I think you have a special opportunity to be touched by the wisdom of Paul Loeb. So I invite you and I ask you, students, put down your notebooks and listen. Really listen to what Paul has to say, because it can really make a difference in your lives. Please join me now in welcoming Paul Loeb.
Very glad to be here. Hope I can live up to all that introduction. That's a little intimidating. What I want to do tonight is to talk about what it means to be a human being in this time, which is, it's a pretty difficult time in a lot of ways. I mean, you look around, you got the war in Iraq, you've got global warming. That was a year and a half ago, about 35,000 people died in Europe of global warming-related heat waves. And if you go to the websites of the biggest insurance companies in the world that insure the insurance companies, their property casualty rates have gone just through the roof. One of them increased 60% in a year from the droughts and the tornadoes and the floods and the hurricanes and all those kinds of linked catastrophes. It's pretty hard to deal with. You go to your rural towns and you see the struggle to keep them going as vital economic and cultural centers, so people just don't quit and leave and head to Kansas City or Chicago. That's hard. That's a challenge. You go and you deal with this economy. Just the economy of getting through school is hard. I mean, it used to be, the point that I went to school, you could get through, and I didn't know a single person who went through to a public college, or even often a private one, who came out with debt for undergraduate. Now, unless your parents are wealthy, I hardly know a single person who doesn't, and that's working 20 hours, 25 hours, 30 hours a week. I mean, part of those are common decisions we've made. It used to be that you have grants to put you through if you didn't come from an affluent background, and those got shifted mostly towards loans in the Reagan years, and so people come out with debt. It used to be that the minimum wage, if you're working your way through school, I was a bartender, made $5 an hour 30 years ago. I could save money working 20 hours a week as a bartender. Run into somebody 25, 30 years later is making $6 an hour. Everything's gone skyrocketing through the roof, but the wages that students make certainly haven't. So in all sorts of ways, I think we face a lot of challenges, just personal and common, that make it tough. And there's a real tendency that I think our culture promotes for us to just kind of turn away from any larger question and just deal with our personal lives and think, well, it's hard enough getting through school, it's hard enough working, it's hard enough finding something you want to do a little bit on the weekend and friends to hang out with and all those normal things. My God, how can I take on these issues of the world? It gets very easily intimidating. And so what I want to suggest, though, is that, in fact, that there are ways that we all can take these issues on, and that if we set a pattern of doing so now, we're much more likely to do so throughout our lives. A lot of times people get intimidated and they feel like they can't act on something because they need to know absolutely everything about it before they take the first step. I call it the perfect standard. And it's a notion that says that if you don't have every single fact, every 17th decimal point statistic, if you can't debate Henry Kissinger on Nightline at the drop of a hat, if you aren't a perfect saint with perfect characters and perfect answers for everything, don't even start. Don't even begin. And it's a myth. It's a kind of notion that we get caught in. It's like I'm a runner, and so I tend to think in track and field metaphors. It's like a high jump bar that's always higher than we can jump. So if you know a little bit about an issue, you learn a little bit more, you get a little confidence, and then that doubt kicks in and you think, oh, but who am I? I don't know enough. And the reality is that people actually learn as they go. I'm not suggesting that ignorance is a good thing. We have a lot of people spouting things that are simply false in this country. That doesn't help. But if you get involved in something and you learn as you go and you listen to the people on the other side, which is always a very useful thing to do, then that pulls you in. That allows you to engage, and you come out 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year. All of a sudden, then somebody else is saying to you, well, you're very eloquent. You know everything about these issues. You know so much, but who am I? I could never be as eloquent as you can. So part of the challenge is getting past that barrier. And I ask myself why it is that we end up with that box. And part of it, I think, is that we don't know how to act. Literally, we don't know how to take a stand on a common issue. We're just not taught. And the example that I'll often give is the Rosa Parks story, because every 7th grader in America knows the name of Rosa Parks, but most citizens in America, whatever age, don't seem to have a clue about her actual story. And it came to me, I was on a CNN show, and Parks was on it by telephone, so I didn't get to meet her, but I was still extremely excited. And they introduced her, and they said, one day Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus. That started the civil rights movement. And I got very upset, because if you know the history, the civil rights movement was already going. I mean, there was a case called Brown versus Board of Education, for instance, that came out of Topeka, not so far from here. And, that was the year before. Somebody had started that, and people were working on that. Rosa Parks herself had been active for 12 years. She was the secretary of the NAACP local. And yet you don't have this. I've never seen like the NBC network cameras zooming in and saying, history is being made, Rosa Parks is taking minutes at a meeting. But yet those were the kinds of humbling actions that build a movement. Ordinary people. She went to training sessions, a place called Highlander Center, a labor and civil rights center in Tennessee, the summer before her arrest. And what I realized is that I started contrasting the CNN version and the real version. And the CNN version says, here's this impossibly heroic woman who comes out of nowhere and instantly changes history and acts completely alone and acts almost on a whim, accidentally, stumbles into history. And the reality is, she's working with other people. There was a guy named E.D. Nixon who was active in the sleeping car porters union that took people's suitcases on the train. He was a union organizer. He was the head of the local. He was the man who got Martin Luther King involved after Parks' action. King was just a young preacher in town. Nobody had heard of him. So part of what the society does is it changes the context. And so it switches it from a sense where you actually, the reality is you act with other people in common, to a sense of just, you have to be so heroic as to do everything yourself, acting alone. It switches it from a sense that when you act intentionally. You always have a leap of faith. There's a wonderful phrase in the new book, The Impossible Will Take a Little While. Activist minister named Jim Wallace says, hope is believing in spite of the evidence and then watching the evidence change. So there's always a leap of faith. But there's also an intentionality. You try and change something, and it could be, a global effort to stop a war or get rid of a president or elect another president or create a community development project in a local town. Whatever it happens to be, it's always intentional. And then there's a certain leap of faith that says, all right, are we going to succeed or not? We don't know. We have to try. But that lesson doesn't seem to get taught by our culture. There's a lesson of persistence. Rosa Parks, again, keeps on. We're talking about 12 years that she's an activist before that day on the bus. And if you think about it, imagine if she'd given up in year 3 or 5 or 7 or 10, we'd never heard of her. So that's a lesson about keeping on. And all of those lessons get stripped away. And if you think about it, think of how many or how few social activists you know from coming of age in this country that are taught in the high schools. I remember one student very eloquently said to me, he said, well, I was saying, well, what do you know about any of these movements, about the civil rights movement, the abolitionist movement, the women's suffrage movement, the union movements, the populist movements? I said, well, we learn the conclusions. We don't learn the process. We learn a few facts, a few names, a few dates. We learn that Lincoln freed the slaves and women got the vote and some unions were organized And we learned that Martin Luther King said, "I have a dream," in Washington, D.C. And we have no real idea how any of that happened. We don't know the stories. And so just think as I'm talking whether or not you've learned those stories. My guess is not. Most people haven't. And so it ends up with situations like I said, I was at college in Minnesota not too long ago, and there was a woman who was a political scientist with a PhD from Yale. So it's about as prestigious as you can get in this country. And she said kind of sheepishly, you know, until I read your book, Soul of a Citizen, I had no idea of the real Rosa Parks story. And I said, Yale didn't teach you that in their political... I mean, you know, I have one thing, she's a mathematician or an engineer. She's a political scientist. I said, you know, Yale didn't teach that in their political science department? She said, yeah, I guess not. So what does that say? You know, it says it doesn't matter where you go, we blank this out. We don't teach this. And think about where it leaves us. It leaves us so much less able to deal with the difficult issues of our time because we don't really have the models. And think about whether or not, I mean, I would really argue that no one should graduate from any school, any college, I'd argue any high school for that matter, without some course that said, okay, here's how you take a stand. Doesn't mean that everyone's going to be on the same page. I mean, you've got a room full of, 600 people. They're going to be split over a lot of issues. That's inevitable. But at least, I mean, that's democracy. It's not a bad thing. At least know how to act, how to take a stand on something you believe in, how to speak out, how changes occurred in the past, how it occurs now. Because we don't learn that. And we're not going to learn it from CNN or NBC or, God help us, Fox. We're not. And, I mean, we're going to get caricatures at best. I mean, I remember it was on the Awful O'Reilly show, and they were interviewing me about global movements, about global economic justice, and I was talking about Thomas Jefferson and sort of fundamental issues, democracy. And the show airs this picture of this, I don't know where they dug it up, some burning bus in Berlin and some police cowering behind a hail of rocks. Had nothing to do with anything I was talking about, but, it was certainly an aversive image, that was for sure. About 50,000 people marched in Seattle about 4 or 5 years ago around the World Trade Organization, entirely nonviolent, except for about 50 crazies who smashed windows. Who got the TV coverage? Well, you can guess. It's the 50 people who smashed the windows. And everyone else is trying to stop them. So we're not going to get an actual look at what it means to take a stand, present or past, from the media. We in some ways have to demand that our educational institutions teach it to us so we can have some sense of the stories and how to act. And I think part of the challenge is to recognize that when we act on any issue, we act step by step. We don't always know where things are going to lead. We don't know where our involvement is going to lead. We don't know where our lives are going to lead. But when we act, I mean, Rosa Parks certainly didn't know that very first meeting she went to, that would lead to her stand on the bus, taking on very difficult issues. In fact, they were taking on issues of lynching, horrendous stuff. I remember being in the Civil Rights Museum where King was killed in Memphis. And there was a picture, I actually think it was from Kansas City, I might be wrong on that, but as I remember it was, of a group of people dressed, I guess I'd call it in their Sunday best, that is men in suits and smoking cigars and women in nice flowered dresses, and they were standing around while a black man was burning in the background. And it was just a chilling picture because they weren't hiding under white sheets. They were sort of proud, or they thought it was a joke, and they had some of them had grins on their faces. And I was just thinking, how can a culture get so distorted that some human beings could take pleasure at the annihilation, the brutal annihilation of another human being's life? And that was the kind of thing that Rosa Parks was taking on at the beginning, where to actually take up that issue was inviting the same fate. It's pretty difficult. You could argue that was as hard as the stand on the bus, or harder. That often, even in situations where we're not under any kind of physical threat, that just talking to our neighbors can be intimidating. There's a woman I write about in Soul of a Citizen named Virginia Ramirez, who lives in San Antonio, dropped out of school at 8th grade, raised her family. Her husband drove a taxi, barely got by, and she got involved in a community group after basically an old woman in her neighborhood died because her house was so run down that the wind would just whip through it every winter, and she gets sicker and sicker and finally died of pneumonia. And when Virginia went to a meeting to try and do something about it and was asked what she could do, and agreed to, after some hesitancy, to hold a house meeting and just talk with her neighbors, she said that the first time she talked with her neighbors, she was so terrified that she said she could barely open the door. She could barely say hello. She said, my knees were knocking, my stomach was clenching. She said, I didn't know, what if I said the wrong thing? I'd never done anything like this before. She said it was just terrifying. But then when she actually started talking to people, she actually found it was fun. But that imagined fear of what it was going to be like to take a stand just completely daunted her. And she got a little bit more involved, and she kind of, she liked that. She felt a kind of confidence grow, but one day she was up there testifying for the San Antonio City Council for the first time, and she just panicked. Her mind went blank. She said, my God, I realized, these were city council people, and I had an 8th grade education, and who was I to talk with them? And she said, not only did I forget my speech that day, I forgot my name as well. I was just so terrified. But then she step by step by step, she keeps getting involved. And then a dozen years later, she ends up in Washington, D.C., testifying for the United States Congress and Senate on a job training bill that her community organization had kind of pioneered, was trying to make a national model. And it's interesting because I asked her, I said, well, weren't you terrified? I mean, these are United States senators. It's pretty intimidating. And she said, well, I was a little nervous, prayed to God I wouldn't make a complete fool of myself, beforehand. But she said, to be honest, I was a lot more scared talking to my neighbors the first time. She said, I was just like a lot more scared. She said, I was just a lot more scared talking to the San Antonio City Council the first time. She said, by the time I got to the United States Senate, I was used to it. I knew I would do the best I could, and that was all I could do, and whatever happened would happen, and I'd keep going. She said, but I did realize afterwards, she said, I was standing out there, and I realized that the people who got me involved, they found a courage and a strength in me that I never knew I had, and a voice. And so it's kind of interesting because from anybody's perspective, you would think that talking before the U.S. Senate would be so immensely daunting, and yet she managed to get, by then, it was easier than that first step. And I think this is a reminder to all of us that oftentimes that first step is just, going to a meeting, on campus even, in the student union, is so difficult in our minds that it may dwarf anything that comes afterwards. And so not being afraid to do that and see where it leads. And we don't always know. One of the most powerful essays in the new book, The Impossible Will Take a Little While, is an essay by Václav Havel, the former Czech president, who was one of the leaders of their democracy movement against the communist dictatorship that was ruling that country. And it's interesting because he wrote this essay in 1986, and the Berlin Wall didn't fall until 1999, and Czechoslovakia didn't have what was called the Velvet Revolution that overthrew the dictatorship until 1989. So he was writing it under a dictatorship that everybody in the world thought was going to continue 10, 20, 50 years. And yet Havel could sort of almost see over the horizon to when that dictatorship would fall, and he was describing the growth of this movement that was challenging it. And in some ways, some of it started with a rock band, which is kind of interesting. It was a band called Plastic People of the Universe that was very influenced by some American rock musicians like Frank Zappa and the Velvet Underground and other bands of the 60s. And the authorities didn't like their music. They called it morbid and, quote, not socially constructive, which I guess depends on your definition of socially constructive. It reminded me a little bit of George Bush and the Dixie Chicks. And so what did they do? They harassed them. They pulled their musicians unions cards so they couldn't make a living at their music. And these were artists. They didn't, they obviously wanted to make a living at their music, but they played anyway, the equivalent of having some kind of an underground rave in a warehouse. And they would just say, here's where we're playing, and people would show up. So they started breaking up the concerts and harassing them. And then they started jailing the musicians. And at that point, Havel, who was a little bit more older and more respectable, formed a defense committee. And That defense committee evolved into what was called Charter 77, which is the pivotal human rights and democracy group in Czechoslovakia. So we went one of these very unexpected leaps of history that nobody could have anticipated, but it did. And he was describing at one point the process where there were some people who were in jail as political prisoners, and Havel himself was in and out of jail constantly during this period. And they were circulating a petition to free them. And people were mocking them, even people who didn't like the regime. There was a very well-known, world-famous novelist named Milan Kundera, who one of his books, and in real life, it was just, he was calling them exhibitionistic and indulgent, and said, these people are not going to do any good. They should quietly help behind the scenes. They're just trying to get attention. And the odd thing is that when I read those words, I realized that I'd heard them before, that I'd heard them levied against students who try and act on campuses, against ordinary citizens. I mean, they're the kinds of universal words of sort of cynicism and contempt that a culture levies on people to intimidate them from acting. And Havel, looking back, said, this is about 7 or 8 years later, he said, you know, it's interesting because on some level those critics were right, that we actually didn't free a single political prisoner at that time, so maybe you could say that our efforts were worthless. But then he says on another level they were completely wrong, because when those people got out of jail, they said that our efforts made them feel like all their sacrifices were worthwhile, allowed them to keep going, to keep challenging that dictatorial regime. He said not only that, but when they started, when they signed that petition, they didn't stop there. So he said the people now who first signed that petition, they went on to keep challenging the regime. And they're playing dissident music, they're preaching dissident sermons, they're teaching differently in the classrooms, they're putting on dissident theater, and in every single way they're challenging this regime, and it's not going to last. And indeed it didn't. So that made me realize something very important. And that is a couple things. One is that you cannot always see for certain what's going to happen in history. Howard Zinn, who's been a lecturer in this Lou Douglas series, wonderful historian, has an essay in The Impossible Will Take a Little While called The Optimism of Uncertainty. And he's talking about time and again, history surprises us and turns in unexpected ways, and people who act for justice, Nelson Mandela calls it the multiplication of courage, find that they inspire. One person inspires another, and they find ways to act. So that part of what occurs is that when you act, you don't know how things are going to turn out. Again, it's that leap of faith. The other thing that happens is that when you act, you're really doing two things. You're engaged in a particular political effort, a critical election, an environmental fight, a fight for greater student aid, a fight to save a rural community, whatever it happens to be. You're also trying to broaden the base of those working for justice. And so there's a historian named Vincent Harding who has a phrase called "there is a river," and he talks about this river of people fighting for justice going back to biblical prophets, speaking out against greed, speaking out against the arbitrary use of power, speaking out for justice. We're part of something larger, not just ourselves. Goes back in time, extends forward. So if we can broaden that river, we're doing something powerful. And so one of the things that happened with Havel is that, in fact, even when they were seemingly failing, they broadened the river of people acting for justice. That was very important. Same thing's true with Rosa Parks. I often ask myself, well, who got Rosa Parks involved? And we know the answer. It's her husband, Raymond Parks, who was active with the NAACP before her. But then I asked the question, who got Raymond Parks involved? And I actually don't know the answer. I mean, it may be in some book that I haven't read, but nothing that I've read describes who got Raymond Parks involved. But if you think about it, pretty profound. There's some unknown person in history who got another unknown person named Raymond Parks involved, who got a then unknown person, his wife to be Rosa Parks, involved. And after a dozen years of her activism, but also his and all those other nameless people, something lights a spark to a moment that we've all heard of. And yet, if that anonymous person hadn't gotten Rosa Parks involved and gotten Raymond Parks involved, history might have been different. So that we don't know that person we got involved, where they're going to end up. I think about that in the movement against the Iraq War. Because I heard a lot of, well, particularly students, but people of all ages say things like, well, I marched, I spoke out, I wrote my congressman, I did what you're supposed to as a citizen, the war happened anyway, they didn't listen, it didn't do any good. And I'm not sure that's wholly accurate. Obviously, those movements didn't stop the war. And I'd argue that we'd have been much better off and much safer if they had. I mean, certainly, I remember there was that recently, right after the first phase of the Iraq War, the quote, mission accomplished phase, they did an international survey of Islamic countries, like major countries, Pakistan, Indonesia, Egypt, I mean, the largest Islamic countries in the world. And majorities or near majorities were so angry with our invasion of Iraq that they said that they trusted Osama bin Laden to, quote, do the right thing in world affairs. What does that mean? That means somebody who is a murderer and a terrorist becomes a hero to millions of people because they are so furious at the U.S. And if he's a hero to that many people, a certain number of them may indeed choose to follow him, which obviously does not make anybody's life safer or does not move the world towards a better place in any way. And so essentially, that's part of what happened to the outcome of the war that many of us were predicting. And I think it's interesting that if we hadn't had that discussion, certainly people are divided on the war still. There's an instinctive tendency to say, well, you're in there, you got to do the best with the situation, you got to survive it, that's the way it is, just keep going. And to justify retroactively, even though we went in there saying, we were in here for the weapons of mass destruction. If you remember, there were pictures, they were showing these charts, here they got this much here, they got this much here, here's their facilities. I mean, they were extraordinarily specific, in the claims they made, and all of those turned out to be untrue. And at the time, there were people who were saying, wait a moment, excuse me, that is not what other intelligence services are saying. It's not what the UN inspectors were saying. Yes, of course, Saddam Hussein is a dictator and a thug and a murderer, but be honest about how you're describing the situation. And I would argue that if nobody had pointed that out, we'd have far less debate about what's going on now. If nobody had pointed out that there might be a backlash, we would have far less debate. If nobody had pointed out that this would just rupture our relations with our allies. I mean, there were surveys recently in the U.S. where people are just simply wrong. That is, they said, we believe, I think it was close to majority, it's probably dropped off since, that they believed that the rest of the world supported us in our action in Iraq. And it simply wasn't true. And you had, I remember every time I heard the word the coalition forces, what I thought of is you have us, and you've got Britain, and then the rest of it is like a child with their imaginary friends. I mean, really, there's there's 200 Poles, I guess, and, maybe there's some people from, tiny Liechtenstein, I don't know. I mean, they're just, and 3 people from El Salvador, and, it's just, it was not, and this is the contrast actually with Bush Sr., where there actually were Islamic countries involved, and there are reasons to question that war, but it was indeed a coalition that did involve a much broader spectrum. And here it really was isolation, and if you look at how the rest of the world regards it, they're almost universally in condemnation. And we don't necessarily know that because we're isolated, and our news media doesn't do a very good job of conveying that. But I think that what's true, though, is that if ordinary citizens hadn't raised those questions, we probably would know still less. We'd probably have still less debate, still less of a sense of what's actually going on. And so that was something that I think people did, even in a apparently failing effort. And then the other thing is that probably 2 or 3 million people in the U.S. came into involvement for the first time, or maybe for the first time in 30 years. I think of my neighbor as a Vietnam vet and an electrician, and he was active a little tiny bit at the end of that war, but not since. And then he just got really upset at this one and started getting involved again. And so one of the questions is what happens if all those people who are absolutely spanning up and down the age spectrum stay involved in larger issues? It's a very powerful force for justice. And I would argue that just the process of bringing new people in, if they stay, you really don't know who's going to be the next Rosa Parks, or the next Nelson Mandela, or the next Václav Havel. You just don't. And so that itself is something immensely powerful. And then when we're acting in a difficult situation, if indeed we can get other people involved, that in itself is something worthwhile doing. also recognizing there are always ways to act. I mean, there's an essay in the new book by Nelson Mandela, and you think of difficult situations to act in. I mean, imagine being taken to this island prison, Robben Island, and told, Mandela, you will never leave here alive. And you're in there a year and you think, okay, I'll get out. 2 years, I'll get out. 3 years. 4 years, you may begin to have some doubts. 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 27 years. It's a long time. How does anybody, and not just Mandela, not just the world-famous figure, how does anybody keep their morale up? And not only keep it up, but come out not with bitterness, but with the generosity of spirit, ready to forgive his jailers. In part by finding ways to resist, finding ways to act. They were denied newspapers. So they would see a guard who would wrap their sandwich in a newspaper, toss it out, and they would smuggle it under their shirts. And in a tiny little coat on a piece of toilet paper, because that would be often the only paper they would have available, they would pass it cell to cell to cell to remind each other that there was an outside world out there, that they were not alone. So part of keeping on requires community. Change requires keeping on, and keeping on requires community. It can be 3 friends, it can be 5 friends. It doesn't have to be 5,000 people. But you never act alone. You always act with other people. And that strengthens you. It gives you more creativity, ingenuity, just more power. And when we do act, there's sort of no telling what we can do. We're limited really only by the power of our imagination. There's another story in the new book that really struck me. I think it's mentioned, there's a 10,000 name email list that I have, and if you sign up outside by where the books are, or you go to theimpossible.org and sign up about once a month, you'll get articles. And one of the things that I did in the process of putting together these sort of chorus of voices on hope is to ask my email list. And I just said, okay, I'm putting together this book. Here's the kinds of people I'm having in. Are there essays that have just wonderful pieces that inspired you? And I got all these pieces in from all over the country, and a couple from all over the world, actually. And one of the ones that came in was from a guy who builds airplanes for Boeing. He works in Washington State, could just as easily work in Wichita. And just a regular person on an assembly line to, builds airplanes. He's also a peace activist, which is how he ended up on my list. And his wife happens to be from Zambia in Africa, which used to be called Northern Rhodesia, and told this amazing story they write about of how they got their independence. It was an effort, largely nonviolent effort, called the Cha-Cha-Cha. And it started when there was a law that if you were black and you bought something at a white store, you had to have it handed out through the window, which was very demeaning. I mean, just humiliating. And so somebody decided to go in and buy a Land Rover. And he bought his Land Rover and said, okay, well, I want it handed out through the window. And they said, oh, no, don't worry, sir, don't worry about that. The gate is open, you paid for your car. Thank you very much, sure, you can drive it out. They said, no, I want the law followed. I want this handed out through the window. And they said, but, sir, we don't think it's going to fit. It's quite a large car, and it's quite a small window. In fact, we're sure it's not going to fit. Here are the keys. You can drive it on out through the gate. Well, they went back and forth a couple more times, and he got in the car, and he drove it out through the window and through the wall as well. And that launched this uprising. And at a certain point later, they were just defying the British in all sorts of ways. And so they brought in one of these sort of stern-jawed colonial types to put down the uprising. And one of the organizers decided to greet him, and greeted him by gathering as many of the largest women she could find to meet him naked on the runway. And you've got to imagine this plane touches down, and he looks out and he sees this sea of large naked women, and he just does not know what to do. And he panics, and he asks the pilot to turn around and go back to England. And a few weeks later, Zambia has its freedom. And I really like that story. And it's powerful because it's about, human imagination and courage and audacity and quite a bit of humor as well, which is why we all laugh at it. And those are necessary qualities to keep on. I mean, this is a difficult time. It's a very difficult time. I would argue, you may disagree, which is perfectly fine. We can talk about it in the question and answer period, but I find this the most dangerous presidency in the history of this country, which I don't say lightly. There are ones that are equally corrupt and tied to huge economic interests, but they didn't have the same global stakes. So the equivalent influence of a Halliburton or an Enron or an Exxon, it couldn't create global warming, it couldn't accentuate global terrorism. What worries me is when they start running ads saying that to speak out is not to be a patriot. They did this. There was a man named Max Cleland, a senator, Democratic senator from Georgia, who lost 2 legs and an arm in Vietnam, and they ran ads with pictures of him of Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein and Cleland's picture, saying he was unpatriotic because he had opposed Bush on some issues. And that seems to me, whatever one stand on any issue at all, it seems to me to violate some kind of fundamental bar. They did the same thing to Tim Johnson, who was the only sitting senator or congressman who actually has a son. He's a Democratic congressman from South Dakota, who actually has a son fighting in Iraq, but who also served in Afghanistan and Bosnia and Somalia. In other words, if there was a place in harm's way, that was where he volunteered to be. And they also ran ads saying he was unpatriotic. And I guess they're now doing it here in this district. I guess Jim Ryan is running ads against his opponent, whose son, who also I understand has at least one son serving in the military, and saying that she's unpatriotic for questioning. And that just seems appalling to me. I mean, it seems to violate some kind of fundamental standard of right. There's a friend of mine who's a retired colonel in the Air Force, now a provost of a college in Kentucky, and he said, what this administration wants when they talk about you're with us or you're an ally of terrorism is that we want us to shut up and color as if we were 8-year-olds. And it just disturbs me. It disturbs me when back in 2000 there was a mob that shouted down Palm Beach vote counters, and that very radical newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, took the picture and said, oh, these are all Republican congressional aides flown in for the occasion. Something wrong with that. When they tossed 1/4 of the black votes in Jacksonville, Florida, or turned about 80,000 people off the lists because they were supposedly felons, but they weren't felons. This was all in Florida. And so I look at that and it strikes me, again, you may have different views on abortion politics or gay politics or taxes or any kind of individual issue, but I think we have to take this issue of the assault on democracy extremely seriously. And if we do, maybe that means, Kansas is probably going to go Republican no matter what. The congressional race is extremely close, where we're promises to be at least in shooting distance. Missouri is very close. Maybe we take a weekend off. We get on a phone bank and call people in Kansas City. Again, our consciences are going to tell us what to do, but I think we have to take those issues seriously. And then we have to keep on, because one way or another, no matter who's elected, history doesn't end on November 2nd. We have to keep on raising the real questions for the long haul. To me, being a patriot is asking the hardest questions in the hardest possible times. And I think there's a way that we can do that without, how to describe it, without being broken down, without being overwhelmed. There's a friend of mine who died at age 101 years old, who was one of the most just inspiring people I ever met, a woman named Hazel Wolf. She was a labor activist, environmental activist. Again, amazing sense of humor. She was once down in Central America during the Central American Wars, and a congressman said to her, she was very active in Audubon, said, oh, I hear, in kind of a condescending tone used for people who aren't too bright, said, oh, I hear you're a bird watcher. And she said, yes, so there's lots of birds in Washington, D.C. that need watching these days. It kind of silenced him. She didn't take herself too seriously either. So that kind of humor and spirit, I would ask her how she persisted, and she would say, well, you go hike on a river, and you climb, you hike on a mountain, or you kayak on a river, or you walk on a prairie, and it revives your soul, and you get some mischievous smile. She said, then you come back ready to take on Exxon. She knew that you didn't have to take on everything. She said, sometimes you have to say no to a good cause. But you can do what you can, and you can do some more. You can do that your whole life. Remember 600 people packing a gym on her 100th birthday party, and several hundred more they weren't allowed in. It was just full. The fire marshals, if they'd come, they would have closed it down in a minute. And everybody had been touched by her life. And there was somebody who said she went to my 7th grade class, and I'd been an environmentalist for 15 years, active ever since. Somebody else said I retired, and the next month she was calling me up to be on a committee and saying, hey, youngster, you're just getting started. I've got a project for you. And then there was a person who was the head of all the Native American tribes in the entire country, sort of National Federation, who was the very first person in his tribe to go to college, and most hadn't gone to high school at that point, and described, he was at the University of Washington, and it was a pretty hostile situation at that point. I mean, he was broke, he was in debt, there were racial comments, ugly stuff. He said, I just kept, nobody in my tribe had prepared me. It wasn't like I had family members who had gone to college. He said, I always thought about dropping out every week, except that Hazel Wolf would knock on my door and say, you're not just doing this for yourself, you're doing this for your community. You have to get through. She said, I would not be here today without her. And imagine living a life with that kind of an impact. I mean, there was a letter in the newspaper, my local newspaper, after September 11th that said, be patriotic, go out and buy a sofa. And I thought, well, that's sort of odd definition of patriotism. You go find it at the mall, next to the Body Shop or something. And I thought, well, aren't there other ways to be patriotic, which is to actually raise the real questions? Seems to me as sort of a more fundamental level. And we can do that and not be beaten down by the difficulty of the issues that we've taken on. I mean, think about somebody like Desmond Tutu. I mean, he has seen in his lifetime people he loved imprisoned, tortured, murdered. I mean, that apartheid regime was just brutal. And you would think that he would have come out of it downhearted or brittle or harsh or just in some way negative towards the world. He's not afraid to speak out at hard issues. He's tackled the task. He did a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which meant trying to get people to tell the stories of the crimes they committed so that that society could live together and proceed, white and black, together in a common future. Tremendously difficult task. He went to Rwanda recently. I mean, people were literally hacking each other apart with machetes and trying to get them to be able to live together. He challenged Bush on the Iraq War. So you would think from all that this would be somebody who would be, I don't know, just consumed with anger or something. Yet, if you've ever had the delight to see him, he almost floats off the ground. He's just sort of the most delightful person, joking, laughing, talking with friends. He loves life. There's no question about that. And I remember I saw him at a benefit in Los Angeles, and he's been battling prostate cancer, so he was kind of feeling ill, and he laid down for a nap beforehand. Then he gets up, he gives his talk, some other people speak, and the band from East LA starts playing some wonderful music, and people start dancing. And I look over, and I think, oh, there's Desmond Tutu dancing right in the middle of the dance floor. And I think, gosh, I've never seen a Nobel Peace Prize winner dance before, much less an archbishop. And, this is very interesting. There's something to learn from this. And I thought, what do I learn? What I learn is that this is somebody, again, who loves life. And if there's dancing, he's going to be part of it. If there's music, he's going to be part of it. If there's conversation and joking, he's going to be part of it. And that is inseparable from that radical prophetic voice that asks the hardest questions. They're one and the same. He loves this world. He's going to fight for it. And so the lesson to me for all of us, I mean, we may not become Desmond Tutu, or maybe we will. I mean, there may be somebody sitting in this room who goes on to shape history in the most visible way, or maybe we'll be the people who shape it in the invisible way. But the lesson is that we have a choice about our lives. And we can duck behind what I call the gated community of the heart. We can try and find salvation and meaning at the mall. That's our national religion, I think, more than any other in reality, if we're going to be honest. Or we can say that our connections with the fellow human beings are what matter most. And then maybe we aren't going to agree on every single page of every single issue that ever comes up in the world, and that's fine. But we're going to do our best to take those difficult issues on, and we're going to keep on doing that, and we're going to do it with others and build that community. And then maybe like Hazel Wolf, I mean, God willing, we'd live out to be 100 years. But at some point in our lives, we'll be able to look back and say we did some things and they mattered. And what better way to live any of our lives? Thank you very much. I can make the question.
I've been called a local activist in the local newspaper.
That's good. It's a
I really
badge of honor.
appreciated your talk tonight. I would like you to maybe, if we can, venture out into a discussion. I lived abroad for 16 years. I've only been back for 6. My reentry was extremely rough. I don't think I'm still happy being here. And what has so disturbed me has been the fundamentalism of both religious and political thought that I came back into after being in Europe, where tolerance is more or less the norm. I mean, we have Monsieur Le Pen and some of these crazy people, but they have their percentage. They're in the parliaments, and people just take them for what they are. But here it seems like it's become almost institutionalized. Henry Giraud, in his most recent book, calls it proto-fascism. And it seems to me that the whole issue about patriarchy and being a patriot and being religious have all become bound into one. And so any discussion or any questioning of what the patriarchy that's ruling our government is doing is seen as not only unpatriotic but also ungodly. And so,
well, I think to me what the danger is, I mean, if I look at the history of movements for justice, religious faith is often a very strong part of them. I mean, it's impossible to understand the civil rights movement without understanding the role of the black churches. It's impossible to understand the abolitionist movement. Even the women's suffrage movement, I mean, major, Methodism, major role in that. I think what's scary, in The Impossible Take a Little While, there's a wonderful radical theologian named Walter Wink who has an essay in the book called Jesus and Alinsky being Saul Alinsky, the godfather of community organizing. They aren't necessarily usually paired together, but I'll let you check out the book and discover the imaginative ways they are. But we were on a panel together in New York, was it 2 weeks ago, and somebody was asking about Bush, and he said, Bush is the Antichrist, and everyone sort of gasped, and is like, this is a very mild-mannered theologian, and he said, well, I want to explain that a little bit, and he said, what's really scary is that if somebody believes that they have a direct line to God, that therefore they need not consult anybody else, therefore there's no humility towards their action. He said, when somebody says they're going to eradicate evil from the world, he said that's God's task, not a human task. That, to posit yourself as the force of, this is a theologian talking, as the force of ultimate right who's going to extinguish evil from the earth. That is the point, that you get movements that annihilate huge numbers of people because they're the absolute certainty of being right. And what I find disturbing is that there's a meshing of, well, really, I would say 3 different currents that I would call, to use theological language, a devil's deal. There are very good-hearted people who believe strongly in issues around abortion or gay rights or whatever, and are led to voting for policies that devastate their communities. I mean, the rural depopulation of Kansas and Nebraska, I mean, this is not accidental. I mean, they're policies that damage family farms again and again and again in favor of corporate interests. Yet the people voting for them are often people who themselves are being destroyed by their communities. Then there's a huge corporate interests that are only too glad to put huge amounts of wealth into buying it. And it doesn't matter whether it's the farm economy and it's Cargill and ConAgra or Exxon or Enron or Halliburton or Merck or whoever it happens to be, to buy policy. And they don't care about abortion or gay rights, but they're only too glad to have a kind of alliance with these sort of, ground troops, to use the metaphor. And then there are the people who love that, the sort of the ultimate cynics who love that political game. I mean, I don't know that Karl Rove has any particularly strong, there's probably leans conservative, but he's not driven by strong convictions. It's the love of power. There's a book, a biography of him called Bush's Brain, and one of the things that he describes is how he basically destroyed the career of a contender to head the Young Republicans when he wanted the job. I mean, they didn't differ in ideology. It was just an obstacle in the road to be destroyed, and he did that time and time again. Did it with Ann Richards in Texas, floating false rumors that she was a lesbian, and that helped get George Bush into office. Did it with a judge, very respected judges, I think was going to run for Congress, where they showed he was active in child welfare stuff. So they showed children, they started floating rumors that he was a pedophile. No basis in fact. I mean, that kind of mix of the economic politics with the ruthlessness, with the fundamentalist religion that I would argue grows, how to describe it? I mean, this is, a simplistic analysis of something very complicated. But if I look at, from what I understand, this is not just American Christian fundamentalism, this is Jewish fundamentalism, this is Islamic fundamentalism. Wherever one looks at the growth of it, part of what happens is it comes out of, in part, populations that feel like the world is collapsing, that things are not going right, that it's out of control, some of which is true, and then they say there was this time when everything was certain. And if we just go back to that time, everything will be fine. And so part of what we have to do is to break people. I mean, I'll give you one more example along those lines. In writing Soul of a Citizen, one of the things I came across was a survey from the Pew Center of the People in the Press that a majority of born-again fundamentalists in the United States favored universal health care. And I called, I couldn't find the physical survey. It had come in a month before. It was lost in my files. And I called the office, and this very nice young woman answers and says, "Oh, that's impossible. They're just a bunch of bigots." And I said, "Well, what? Their kids don't get sick or something?" And she called back very shamefacedly, and of course it was true. And so part of the challenge, I think, is to be able to say, let us have a genuine dialogue with those people who are the ordinary people in those congregations, because we may have a whole lot more in common with them than we think, even as we also differ on other issues. And that's the hope of breaking them off from these coalitions that are immensely destructive to their communities. But we have to do that hard work, and it is hard work. But it's the only way that things are going to change.
Do you think that, I don't know, my feeling is that there's a large movement towards conformity in the country? You think that is something that's becoming fashionable for a long period of time, or just a fad that was brought on by the terror of 9/11? We all need to come together and be the same.
It's a hard question. I don't know if, I think that there was a couple different sequential responses to 9/11. And this is my memory. I was at a Southern Baptist college in Birmingham, Alabama that day. And they called me. I was supposed to talk at a convocation at 11. They said, "You better turn on the TV. This is going to change everything about what you're going to say," as it obviously did. And then two people volunteered to drive me to Dallas, Texas the next day, because the planes weren't flying. And it's 900 or 850 miles from Birmingham to Dallas. And I saw that first week two things going on. One is this just outpouring of generosity of every person. People even said something simple like, you're putting their luggage up on their overhead rack on the airline, and 4 people are helping any person who looks like they might have a difficult time. It was this sort of generosity of spirit, perhaps exemplified by the firefighters and the police officers who died. And there was also questioning, and it was odd. I saw friends of mine who are Middle East experts who really do know about this region, but rarely get into the mainstream press. Suddenly, USA Today, New York Times, Washington Post, their pieces are running for about a week and a half. And then it started closing off. And the initial response of, this is how to describe it another way. The talk I gave in Dallas, I gave on about 4 hours of sleep, maybe 3. So I wasn't at my best. And I was completely raw emotionally, and I wasn't being careful in my words because I just didn't have the emotional energy. I just talked from the heart. And it was a pretty radical speech, I think. And it happened to be one of those times where they hand out little note cards to evaluate the talk. And this is Dallas. And the person who brought me in said she was thinking, God, there's a lot of people packing heat in Dallas. Is somebody going to whip out a gun and shoot me? They loved it. They absolutely, she said they'd never had such a response, a positive response across the board to the lecture. I think if I'd given the same talk 2 weeks later, maybe somebody would have pulled out the gun and shot me. I don't know. But they certainly wouldn't have liked it. So there was an opening of the soul, if you will, right afterwards that could have been so powerful. And then it got just whomped on. And it got replaced by this definition. I remember Bush said, this is the war of good versus evil. And obviously those were evil actions. I mean, if you can call an action evil, those were evil actions. But when he says the war of good versus evil, and it's members of his administration that 25, 30 years ago had helped bring Osama bin Laden into politics by supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, then the good versus evil lines get a little bit muddy. As they do with Saddam Hussein, when you go back, whatever is to the Bush senior administration, and there's Donald Rumsfeld shaking hands, putting his arm around and delivering massive amounts of aid after he's gassed his own people. So I think that what happened is there was this redefinition. And my guess is that we're still struggling with that. And it probably, to be honest, I can't imagine, it's going to recede. But I'm going to remember 9/11 the rest of my life. I think most of us will. So that's going to be there as a defining moment for us. And then for most people, and the question really is, what do we do with it? Do we use it to ask the really hard questions about what would create a just world? You have to catch the people who did it, and it's fine to search the stuff on the airliners, and there's practical things to do. But you really have to go with the roots, or are we going to deny the roots and just say, we are the righteous crusaders, and we'll just wipe out the evildoers, and then surprise, surprise, more of them pop up because they're so angry. So we've got to go, Iraq, we'll go to Syria, we'll go to Iran, we'll go to, a friend of mine has a bumper sticker, elect Bush, 4 more wars, we have a real choice. And I think that choice is going to, that's going to be the political ground that all of us are going to be working in. Because the fear is real, in part because there are some legitimate reasons for fear. Because those actions were so horrible. So that's what part of what we have to do, is to really struggle with this, to say, this path doesn't make us safer. It in fact makes us less safe. And that's hard. It's a hard conversation. But if we don't initiate, who's going to? Do you have a follow-up, or that's?
Not yet.
Okay.
Yes, sir. The Bush administration and their supporters tend to be very big on community volunteerism and one-on-one aid to those who are poor and powerless. How effective is that as a technique for change, or is it just another technique for maintaining political and social inequality?
Yeah, I think that, I remember the 1,000 points of light phrase of his father, well, Peggy Noonan wrote it, but of his father's administration. And, the way to look at it is this. It's not like the volunteerism is bad. You go out and you build a house for Habitat, you mentor a kid with a Big Brother and Big Sister program. That's all good stuff. You get involved in a literacy program. But it's sort of like, there was a student who said, very well-meaningly from Stanford, he said, I just hope that I've learned so much volunteering in this homeless shelter. I just hope that my grandchildren get the opportunity to volunteer in the same homeless shelter that I have. And his friends said, well, that's not really what we're doing here. And that's the trap of the 1,000 points of light, is that you can't do this stuff voluntarily. And at some point, you look at something like Habitat, which is an organization I really respect. The situation for low-income housing has gotten worse in the United States during the existence of Habitat. Not that Habitat has been bad in any way, but that for every house that Habitat has built to house a family, 3 or 4 or 5 housing units have been lost to low-income people because the low-income housing programs have all been gutted. And Habitat itself is now shifting to start taking on social advocacy as part of what they do. So in a way, I was talking to somebody yesterday, I guess it was, who was describing the dilemma for nonprofits. And she said things are really bad for nonprofits. And they're worse for social change nonprofits because with all the cuts in different, the Bush administration, to give the $130 billion a year to the wealthiest 1 or 2%, and to fight the war in Iraq, they've cut low-income health care, housing, child care, energy assistance programs, community clinics, boys and girls club programs in the public libraries. Every list of everything you can think of. And I said what's happened is now some of the foundations run in to fill the gap. But what happens is, they used to give maybe to more community advocacy groups. That money is now gone. And I think that the people who push through people like Grover Norquist, who talk about wanting to shrink government to the point where they can strangle it in the bathtub. He's a Republican strategist. They're very happy with that. I mean, they're very happy to say, well, if you want to feed these people, that's fine. You go feed them. We're not going to do that. You know, we may have $1 billion of wealth. We may make $2 million a year. We don't want to feed these people. You can if you want to. So I think that what we have to do in voluntarism is, if that's our starting point, that's fine. But then bear witness. Talk about the situations that we see out there. Talk about what could change them. Bring people together to say, you know, we had an affection for this kid. We're going to ask about what can fund their school and why their school in a poor neighborhood is way underfunded versus a school in a rich neighborhood. We've got to talk about that stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi. I'm a history professor here, and the whole first part of your talk is basically something I'd like you to give to our chair, because we need a lot more hires. I really feel like we need more historians. You made me feel really good, because that's what I do every day, is try to create context for students. And I'd like to talk more about the process, because what I encounter in students is a lot, has been touched on a lot here, but there's a strong streak of anti-intellectualism in American culture. And it's not just that, you know, about my political views or this or that, but more along the line of I'm closed off for my students because I have a PhD. In spite of the fact, I have to actually work to reach them in spite of the fact
So what
that
is
I'm
that?
knowledgeable.
Explain a little bit more. I mean, I don't think it's just a PhD. What exactly, when you say intellectualism, what is it that you're hitting?
Well, it's for example, when I talk to students about the environment, the initial, I teach environmental history, so the initial reaction I get is that, she's just a tree hugger. This is what my parents and my community and, you know, whatever, their church or whatever, warned me about. They warned me that there would be people who would try to get me to think about this, and I'm going to resist thinking about it. No, my strategy is that I make them do current events every single day, and I don't have to say anything. Because as soon as they start to read it for themselves and tell each other about it, my job's over. But it's getting over that initial sense that somehow talking to someone at university, even though they are here, is going to somehow corrupt their basic values and principles, and that process is frustrating to me, and I want to know what you think about that.
I mean, you should come. We're doing a workshop for faculty tomorrow, which you at noon? No, at noon. What? Where? Okay, so you should definitely come to that, because I can, you know, talk a lot more about that process there. But to answer briefly here, but please do come. I think that people grow up in this society, and often in cocoons, for lack of a better word. You know, it's like this kind of web of silk that's spun around that says, this is the way I'm brought up to see the world. And so if somebody starts suggesting you see the world differently, it's a shock. I don't know if it's anti-intellectual. I think it's a different worldview. It's a different context. It's a different process for talking about things. I mean, the high schools ought to be doing this stuff, but they usually don't. And so I think people have to adjust, and it's difficult. I mean, if you ask, nonetheless, you ask most on something like the environment, most freshmen, you know, do they believe that we should have more care in preserving their environment? About 80 to 85% of freshmen are saying, yeah, we should. So it's not as if people aren't. I mean, that's progress won by earlier movements. It's not as if people, you know, are sort of resistant to that inherently, but they are very much unused to seeing themselves as activists. They're very much, they've not gotten that tradition, and the image is a stereotype of a tree hugger. You know, if somebody with hair down, hasn't washed in decades, hair down to here, definitely wears Birkenstocks and eats granola every day, and, you know, if you don't put yourself in that stereotype, you're going to think, ugh, I wouldn't want to be one of those people. You know, at the same time, part of the challenge is having the conversation. I heard the new book of mine has an essay by a wonderful environmental activist named Bill McKibben, and writer, and he told a story that I actually didn't know. Well, what happened is at the same event in New York with Walter Wink, well, actually it was the day before, but this is a series of two events. I said, as an example of reaching out, I said, well, there was this very interesting campaign that was started by Evangelicals for Social Action called What Would Jesus Drive? About what kind of cars people had. And the conclusion was Jesus would definitely not be driving a Hummer, and he probably wouldn't be driving an SUV. He would be driving a car that lived lightly on the earth. And I said, this is interesting that that's coming out of that movement. And what McKibben said is, well, actually, it got its start earlier. He said, I actually came up with that slogan, which I didn't know. He said it started, I think it was in the Methodist Church that McKibben's part of. It started there in these more liberal church circles. They then took the very difficult, risky step of bridging out and engaging these evangelical communities. And a certain number of them responded to that and, in fact, spearheaded and provided the money and the energy for that campaign, which got a huge amount of coverage. So part of the challenge is trying to work within people's existing frameworks, but push those frameworks, push the boundaries of them, and recognizing that if we're presenting people something difficult, it's going to be a little bit of adjustment. It's going to be difficult. So I honestly don't think it's a PhD. I think it's that, if you're presenting things in a way that people aren't used to, it's going to be an adjustment. It's going to be queasy territory, and we need to know that, and we need to respond with, how do I describe it? With a kind of compassion. I don't mean a paternalistic compassion. I mean, there's a friend of mine who's actually very politically liberal, teaches at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and the head of the Young Republicans said, I probably don't agree with a single thing that Glenn stands for, but he's redeemed my faith in humanity by the passion of his teaching, which means that he's not up there as a PhD, even though he has one. He's up there as a human being who happens to have a certain set of knowledge, wrestling with the world. And I think that's how people respond, but obviously treating the students with a lot of respect. I think that's how change can occur, yeah.
This is going back a couple of topics.
Sure.
You said that the war is scary because Bush is a crusader against evil in his mind,
Right,
etc.
right.
But do you think, which is more scary to you, Bush continuing for 4 years, or Kerry, who doesn't seem to have a concrete plan and will go into ending the war with the idea that the war is bad? And there's a lot of criticism against that, saying that if he goes out there saying, I don't support the war that we're in, that other nations will see that as bad. Like, what's your view on that?
Well, other nations do not like the war to begin with. I mean, we have to recognize that the majority of the world really disapproves of this war in a serious way. I mean, that is why we cannot, it's not that they're cowards. I mean, they've joined in other, there are European peacekeeping forces in Bosnia who, risk getting shot at and whatnot. I mean, they genuinely just did not believe in this war. So, to me, the problem, there is, again, if I'm going to say what's the sort of two, I don't know what you call them, fatal sins, for lack of a better word. I know I'm using a whole lot of theological language tonight, but it's the best phrase I can think of the administration. It's the assault on democracy and people who disagree with them, and it's the lack of humility, so that there's no point that they're willing to recognize that they're wrong, which is really troubling, because they get in a mess, they get in deeper, and they just don't recognize. That they absolutely, at the very least, had no idea what the hell to expect when they're going in there. And so to me, that is devastating. And I think Bush is just, A, wedded to that war, and B, very, very likely not only to have that war, but to embark on others as well. I think, Iran or Syria were the most likely candidates. They'll go after that and drag us in deeper. And, the one thing that Osama bin Laden does want, and that we do not want, is a global war of Islam versus the West. We just do not want that, because a whole lot of people are going to die if that's the war. And if you have a person who is doing unacceptably murderous criminal actions, and the whole world disavows them and tries to hunt them down, that's how you deal with somebody like Osama bin Laden. You isolate them as much as possible, you dry up their base, and then you find out where they are and you catch them. And you jail them, or you do whatever you have to. But that's how you deal with it. Now, if I'm going to respond to Kerry, I think Kerry has an excess of political caution that doesn't always serve his own higher instincts. And I say that as a criticism. But if I say which person is more fundamentally in touch with reality, at least he recognizes that there's some fundamental, there are serious problems with that whole war, the process through which it was. Will it take citizen pressure if he's elected to get him out? Probably, almost undoubtedly. I don't see any way around it. But will he be digging in his heels the way less than Bush? Absolutely. He's not as wedded to it. And, so I think that's, and the longer we stay there, again, the one thing, watching him in that debate, he said some things that were very important and skirted around a few others. But when he mentioned the thing about the U.S. bases, it's exceptionally important. I mean, if we want to, quote, see ourselves as liberators, we are putting bases in there, doing long-term contracts with Halliburton and defending the oil ministry. That's not a power that intends to overthrow Saddam Hussein and leave. It's a power that intends to stay. And I wish he'd mentioned that more. In fact, I emailed the people I know in the CARE campaign and said, hammer away, because people don't know that. And that's Bush's plan, is to make this a base head in the Middle East. And, and that needs to be brought out, because as long as we're there, we are the symbol of colonialism to that region, and they're going to flock for nationalist reasons to get us out. I mean, if you think about, the fighting in the last couple of weeks, the fighting we've had against Sadr and his militias, this is somebody he's not a Ba'athist, he's not a Saddam Husseinite. His father and his uncle were murdered by Saddam Hussein. So he ought to be welcoming us, but he's somebody we've been locked in a fight with for 6 months. What that says to us is that, yeah, there's some people, left over from the Saddam Hussein regime, and yeah, there's some people, coming in from other countries, but that basically most of the population, there's surveys, 90% of them want us out. And as long as we're in there, our poor troops are going to be targets for everybody to attack. So to me, I wish Kerry opened it up more distance on the war, but at least the difference to me is significant. And then if I look at the fact that he actually recognizes that there is something called global warming, and has actually taken, I would say, it's an area we actually taken a lead historically. It's one of the areas where he has been courageous, that he recognizes that you don't want to smash every union and drag every minimum wage down to nothing, and have the wealthiest just get off tax-free so the rest of us pay that. Lots and lots of issues, huge gaps. The war a little bit less than I'd like, but I still think it's significant. Let's see, back over there and then back over there.
Hi. I wanted to ask you a question, sort of respond to the whole idea of anti-intellectualism. I wish I had that much respect in my classroom. I don't run into so much of the anti-intellectualism. It's there. I think it's very strong. But what concerns me more is the incredible greed and materialism of corporate America that, to me, underlies an awful lot of that. And I remember, I'm old enough to have been in the civil rights movement and the peace movement in Vietnam, and we weren't as media bound as we are now, and that's what I find very hard. When you do try to be a grassroots activist, it's very hard to find people who read simply because we have the soundbite in the media. Right. And my husband shows a film in his class that leaves the students stunned, and it's called Advertising and the End of the World. And it basically looks at the way people live within advertising, what it's doing to the environment, what it's doing to the world, and they go out stunned, because my students tend to say to me, I'm in the performing arts, so we're really, out there in a different world. And my students say to me, well, it's wonderful, but I can't make a living at it. And I'm also noticing that it's harder and harder for middle-class people to make a living. My daughter-in-law's mother, just after 28 years with Delta Airlines, is going to lose her entire pension, but the corporate executive is going to take a $16 million package. And I'm waiting for people to be in the streets. Yeah. And I don't see people in the streets, and I wonder if it's because of the media.
Well, the media, part of the challenge, two things. One is you cannot act for change and rely on the conventional media for your information. I get there's some websites I like a lot. Well, my website has a lot of links. SoulOfACitizen.org has a lot of links, or theimpossible.org. But there's a website called Common Dreams out of Maine, or workingforchange.com out of California. It's also a progressive telephone company that actually donates millions of dollars a year to good causes, and you get to vote on it and see where your money goes. Or Alternet, or there's a number of those sites, to get your information from alternative sources, but also break people away from that tube, because time and again they've surveyed, the more people watch television, the less they know about. We're just talking about facts that are unquestionable, the less they know, and so it's breaking people away from that, and that is a serious challenge. It really is. We have to recognize what's going on. The polarization of wealth in society is obscene. I remember there was happening in Vancouver, British Columbia, and Paul Allen, I live in Seattle, where Paul Allen of Microsoft is from, and Paul Allen's second yacht was visiting the city. We know this is like my other car is a Cadillac, his second yacht had a crew of, I think it was over 100. It had, I think, 2 helicopter pads, a couple of other little boats on it, at least one, maybe 2 full-scale swimming pools, screening rooms. And I'm thinking, this is his second yacht? What's his first yacht like? This is what we're essentially privileging while we cut off, my son's high school laid off 11 teachers. And we've got to talk about those choices. And we're not getting them from the TV. Yeah, last question. Okay, last question.
First, I'd like to add to your answer about the war in Iraq.
Yeah, sure, please do.
I was there. I'm a former U.S. Army officer. There was no decent plan from the beginning from Bush.
So you just literally got back?
Yes.
Wow.
I've been back about a year.
Wow.
There was no good plan.
Yeah.
And there still isn't.
Yeah.
I have friends that are still there dying.
Yeah.
My question is, if you were a new activist just starting out, especially in a conservative community like we have here, what would you do to get started and get other people motivated and out there with you?
Well, I think a couple of things. I would connect with existing organizations, and this would be true in a more conservative community, and in a less one too. I would see who's out there. I would see which groups you really click with and resonate with. It's always harder to invent something from scratch. I would, when talking with people, talk about the story of why you got involved. I think that's true for all of us. In your situation, you have a history which is automatically going to make people want to listen to you because you say, I was over there, and people are like, well, oh, okay, I will listen to you. I'm even the most conservative person I think will listen because you were over there, and they weren't. But even if you're not in that situation, which most folks in this room probably aren't, you still have a process of coming into involvement that you can talk about, and you can explain that. And the myth is you have to know the answer to every question somebody will ask you. You don't. You have to simply be able to say, this is why I'm asking, this is why I'm acting, and if you disagree with me, I'll listen to what you're saying and I'll respond. But it's not as if it's a quiz show. It's about honoring the process that brings us in, and then connecting with good people to support us, because of course we can't do this alone. And finding ways to speak, and taking that very difficult challenge of going into environments where they don't necessarily believe what we do. And again, in your particular case, you'll have some extra leverage, because at least on issues like the war, because of your background. They'll be readier to listen to you than somebody who hasn't been there. But whoever we are, it's that same task of reaching out. And then to know that if it seems frustrating sometimes, the phrase, I didn't mention the title of the new book, it's from a Billie Holiday song, and then also the motto of the Army Corps of Engineers in World War II, which is, the difficult will do it once, the impossible will take a little while. That sometimes to achieve the real changes, it does take a little while, but it's not impossible. Thanks so much.